I accidentally opened an old bank account that I had not used for 8 years. There was $50 million in it. I called the bank. When I found out who wired the money, I realized my perfect family was plotting to send me to a federal psychiatric ward by tomorrow morning. Before I share how I burned their empire to the ground, let me know where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives. The humiliating end of my relationship with my family began at an exclusive country club in Atlanta. Crystal chandeliers hung low over tables covered in white silk. My sister Vanessa and her husband Trent were celebrating their 5th wedding anniversary. I sat at the far end of the table nursing tap water. Vanessa sat at the center glowing in a designer gown. Trent sat beside her holding court. He was a Wall Street finance guy who loved reminding everyone that he was the white savior who brought real wealth into our lives. He constantly made snide remarks about how I needed to be more agreeable to succeed. I tried to stay invisible, but Trent always needed an audience. The waiter approached, holding a silver tray with a leather folder. Trent snatched it up and glanced at the receipt. He chuckled and tossed the folder directly onto my plate. The heavy leather smacked against my salad, splashing dressing onto my blouse. "You take this one," Aaliyah, Trent said loudly enough for neighboring tables to hear. $4,000 for the vintage champagne. "You need to learn the value of hard work instead of freeloading off our success." The table went silent. My stomach twisted into knots. $4,000 was my rent and groceries for 2 months. I am a forensic accountant. I work 60 hours a week, tracking down hidden assets for corporate audits. I know the value of hard work, but I did not have $4,000 to blow on champagne I never drank. Trent. "I am not paying for your drinks," I said, keeping my voice low. "I drank tap water all night." My mother Brenda slammed her wine glass down. The liquid splashed over the rim. She wore her pearls and her signature disappointed glare. She lived for her status in the elite black high society of Atlanta, her Jack and Jill board meetings, and her front row seat at my father Calvin and his megachurch. To her, I was an embarrassment. "Do not embarrass us, Aaliyah," my mother hissed, leaning across the table. "Your sister is a vice president at a marketing firm now. You are just a number cruncher sitting in a cubicle. Pay the bill. It is the least you can do since your father and I paid off your student loans." I stared at her. The sheer audacity of her lie made my blood boil. The wealthy patrons at the next table were definitely listening now. "You did not pay my student loans, Mom," I replied, projecting my voice clearly. "I worked 3 jobs during college. I cleaned dorms at night and tutored freshmen while taking a full course load. You and Dad took the college fund my grandfather left me and used it to buy Vanessa a Mercedes-Benz for her 19th birthday, just to keep up appearances." Vanessa let out a dramatic gasp, touching her chest. "You are so bitter, Aaliyah. You are always bringing up the past because you cannot handle that. I built a successful brand while you are still struggling to pay rent. You are 31 years old and completely miserable." My father Calvin sat silently at the head of the table. He was a prominent pastor and real estate developer. He watched his wife and golden child tear me apart and did nothing to stop it. He just adjusted his gold watch and took another sip of his scotch, ignoring my public humiliation. Trent laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed in the quiet dining room. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his black American Express card. He flicked his wrist and threw the heavy metal card right at my chest. It bounced off my collarbone and clattered onto the floor. "Since you are so broke, I will let you use my card." Trent sneered with a self-satisfied smirk. "Go fetch the waiter and run the card like a good girl. Maybe if you make yourself useful, I will give you a tip for the cab ride back to your little apartment." I looked at the black card resting on the floor. I looked at my sister smiling smugly. I looked at my mother, who was nodding in agreement with Trent, completely supportive of his racial microaggressions and disrespect. I did not yell. I did not cry. I picked up my purse and pushed my chair back from the table. The sharp scrape of the wood against the floor made several people jump. "I am leaving now," I said. "You can fetch the waiter yourself, Trent." I turned my back on them and walked out of the country club holding my head high. The humid Atlanta air hit my face as I stepped into the night. My hands were shaking with anger and humiliation. I checked my bank app on my phone while waiting for my ride. My checking account had exactly $42 left right now. I needed to make my apartment rent by Friday or face eviction. I remembered an old college bank account I had opened 8 years ago at a local branch across town. There might still be a few extra $100 left in it from an old tax refund. I decided I would go to the bank first thing tomorrow morning to close it out and take whatever cash was left. I had absolutely no idea that walking into that bank tomorrow would change my entire life forever. The morning sun was already baking the Atlanta pavement by the time I walked up to the heavy glass doors of the Midtown Bank branch. I had not slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Trent throwing his credit card at my chest and my mother nodding in approval. I pulled the heavy door open and stepped into the air-conditioned lobby. The marble floors gleamed and the quiet hum of wealth filled the room. I felt completely out of place in my faded work blouse and scuffed flats. I just needed to close my old college checking account. I knew there was exactly $42.16 sitting in there. It was a pathetic amount, but combined with the tips I had saved from a side gig, it would be just enough to stop my landlord from posting an eviction notice. I walked up to the teller counter. A young woman with a neat name tag that read Sarah offered a polite professional smile. I handed over my driver license and a crumpled piece of paper with the old account number written on it. I explained that I wanted to close the account and withdraw the remaining balance in cash. Sarah typed the numbers into her keyboard. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers click away. Then she stopped. Sarah stared at her monitor. Her professional smile vanished. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. She looked up at me, then back down at the screen. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. She whispered for me to wait just one moment. I watched her stand up and walk hurriedly over to the branch manager's office. The office had frosted glass walls, but I could see her gesturing frantically toward her screen. My forensic accountant brain immediately went into overdrive. Panic gripped my chest. I assumed the worst. I thought a dormant account maintenance fee had piled up over the past 8 years and compounded into some massive debt. I pictured thousands of dollars in overdraft fees. I was already calculating how long it would take me to pay it off on my current salary. I braced myself for the worst as the heavy glass door of the office swung open. The branch manager stepped out. He was an older black man with silver hair at his temples and a perfectly tailored navy suit. His nameplate read, Mr. Sterling. He bypassed the teller counter completely and walked straight toward me. He did not look angry. He looked at me with a mixture of profound respect and deep concern. He asked me to please follow him into the private VIP conference room. I told him I just wanted my $40 and I did not want any trouble. He gently placed a hand on my shoulder and assured me there was no trouble at all. The conference room smelled like expensive leather and fresh coffee. Mr. Sterling closed the blinds and locked the door behind us. He sat across from me at the heavy mahogany table and slid a printed bank statement face down across the polished wood. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. I asked him how much I owed the bank. Mr. Sterling shook his head slowly. He told me I did not owe the bank anything. He told me to turn the paper over. My hands were shaking as I flipped the thick cardstock. I looked at the bottom line. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking the lack of sleep was making me hallucinate. The number printed next to my name was $50 million. 50 followed by 6 zeros. I let out a sharp, nervous laugh. I pushed the paper back toward him. I told him I was a financial auditor, and I knew a routing error when I saw one. I explained that some massive corporate wire transfer must have accidentally bounced into my dormant checking account. I told him to reverse it before the corporate clients realized their money was missing. Mr. Sterling did not laugh. He pushed the paper right back to me. He leaned forward and clasped his hands together. He told me there was no routing error. The money was entirely mine. He explained that it came from a blind trust set up exactly 8 years ago by my late grandfather Jeremiah. The breath left my lungs. Grandfather Jeremiah. He was the only person in my family who ever truly saw me. while my father Calvin paraded around his megachurch in custom suits bought with the congregation's tithe money. Jeremiah wore scuffed work boots and drove a beat-up truck. He ran a construction company and always told me that real wealth was quiet, while fake wealth was loud. My parents always treated Jeremiah like an embarrassment. They told everyone he died broke. Mr. Sterling explained that Jeremiah had quietly liquidated his construction empire before he passed away. He placed the entire $50 million into a heavily guarded trust. The trust was legally programmed to mature and deposit directly into this specific forgotten checking account the day after my 31st birthday. Jeremiah knew my family. He knew their greed. He knew that if he left me the money in a traditional will, my father and my sister would find a way to contest it and bleed me dry in court. He hid it where no one would ever think to look. He trusted me to be smart enough to find it when the time was right. I sat back in the leather chair trying to process the magnitude of what this meant. $50 million. I was rich. I was completely, utterly free. I would never have to sit at the end of a table and let Trent humiliate me ever again. I would never have to listen to my mother call me a failure. I told Mr. Sterling I needed to move the funds immediately into a secure, independent account that only I could access. Mr. Sterling's expression suddenly turned grim. The warmth left his eyes, replaced by a sharp, urgent intensity. He leaned across the table, his face inches from mine. His voice dropped to a harsh, raspy whisper. He told me it was a miracle I walked through the doors at 9 in the morning. He pulled a thick manila folder from his briefcase and laid it on the table. He told me that yesterday afternoon, right before the bank closed, my father Calvin and my brother-in-law Trent sat in the exact chairs we were sitting in right now. My heart hammered against my ribs. I asked him what they were doing here. Mr. Sterling opened the folder. Inside was a legal document stamped with a county judge's seal. It was a full medical power of attorney. Mr. Sterling explained that Calvin and Trent had submitted paperwork legally declaring me mentally incompetent and a severe danger to myself. They claimed I was having a psychotic break. Armed with that forged court order, they had requested total control over all my financial assets. The air in the room grew ice cold as the pieces clicked together in my mind. The dinner last night, Trent pushing me to the breaking point, my mother loudly declaring me an unstable embarrassment in front of witnesses. They were setting the stage. They were building a narrative to justify locking me away. Mr. Sterling pointed to a red highlighted section at the bottom of the document. He whispered that Calvin and Trent had already scheduled a complete wire transfer of all $50 million. The money was set to be drained from my account and moved into an offshore holding company registered in Trent's name. The automated transfer was locked in the system. It was scheduled to execute today at exactly 3:00 in the afternoon. I realized with absolute horrifying clarity that my perfect family was not just trying to steal my grandfather's legacy. They were actively plotting to have me thrown into a federal psychiatric ward by tomorrow morning so I could never fight back. The silence in the conference room was deafening. I stared at Mr. Sterling, my mind racing. The initial wave of terror vanished, replaced by a cold, mechanical clarity. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my life tracking hidden assets, untangling corporate fraud, and finding money that people desperately want to keep hidden. My family thought they were dealing with the quiet, obedient girl they had beaten down for 30 years. They thought my job was just crunching numbers in a cubicle. They forgot what I actually do for a living. I took a deep breath and asked Mr. Sterling for access to a secure banking terminal. I needed to block the withdrawal immediately, and I needed to do it in a way that left no loopholes. He pushed his heavy laptop across the mahogany desk and logged in with his executive credentials. I did not just freeze the forged power of attorney. I flagged it as fraudulent in the federal banking system, linking it to suspected identity theft. Then I secured the account itself. I established a biometric lock requiring my physical presence, my signature, and a retinal scan for any future movement of funds. But as I stared at the screen, I knew that was not enough. If Trent and my father actually succeeded in getting me committed to a psychiatric facility, they could potentially petition a judge to bypass the biometrics by declaring me a ward of the state. The money could not stay in this account. It could not even stay in the country. I spent the next 2 hours working side by side with Mr. Sterling. I used my industry contacts and his banking authority to set up a blind limited liability company registered in the Cayman Islands. It was a completely anonymous corporate entity, protected by strict international privacy laws that not even Trent's Wall Street lawyers could crack. At exactly 11 in the morning, I authorized the wire transfer. I watched the progress bar on the screen as $50 million vanished from the local Atlanta branch and reappeared safely offshore, completely out of my family's reach. I left exactly $42.16 in the original checking account. If Trent wanted to execute his forged withdrawal at 3 o'clock this afternoon, he could have my rent money. As Mr. Sterling finalized the transfer paperwork, a sickening thought crept into my mind. The timing of their attack was too perfect. I had not mentioned this bank account to anyone in 8 years. I had only decided to come here last night, after leaving the country club in tears. How did my father and Trent know to file the power of attorney yesterday? How did they know I was making financial moves? I pulled my phone from my purse. My mother Brenda had bought me this phone last Christmas, claiming it was an olive branch to help us stay connected. She had insisted on setting it up for me on the family data plan. I unlocked the screen and opened the deepest system settings. I bypassed the standard menus and dug into the background application data, analyzing battery usage and hidden location permissions. It took me less than 5 minutes to find the parasite. A military-grade tracking and mirroring application was buried deeply inside a generic pre-installed weather app. They had been watching my every move. They had been reading my private emails, monitoring my bank logins, listening to my calls, and tracking my physical location for months. I felt physically sick. My own mother had handed me a Trojan horse wrapped in holiday paper. I did not delete the app. If I deleted it, they would know I was onto them, and they would change their tactics. Instead, I used a network tracing tool to find the host server. The subscription for the spyware was being paid monthly on an auto-renew cycle. I pulled the billing details from the server registry. The credit card linked to the tracker was a corporate American Express. It was registered to Trent's hedge fund on Wall Street. My arrogant white brother-in-law was using his corporate expense account to illegally stalk his black sister-in-law. He and my father had orchestrated this entire psychiatric hold based on data they stole right from my own pocket. They watched me struggle to buy groceries. They watched me stress over my student loans. They watched me hustle to build a career while they plotted to steal my grandfather's legacy and lock me in a padded room. I set the phone face up on the polished wood table. Mr. Sterling watched me with a silent understanding. He knew I was no longer a victim. I was preparing for a war. Suddenly the screen lit up. A new text message appeared. It was from my father Calvin. I stared at the notification banner as the words scrolled across the glass. Sweetheart, come by the house tonight. Trent has some routine tax documents for you to sign. It will only take a minute and I will give you $500 for your trouble. I stared at the text, reading it over and over. $500 to sign away my freedom and $50 million. They thought I was desperate for cash. They thought I was completely clueless. I picked up the phone. My fingers were completely steady as I typed my response. See you at 7. The drive to my parents' estate in Buckhead felt like a march to the executioner block. My tires crunched against the pristine white gravel of their sweeping circular driveway. The mansion loomed ahead with its massive columns and perfectly manicured hedges, projecting an image of holy perfection and untouchable wealth. I parked my 10-year-old sedan next to Vanessa's brand-new Porsche. I sat in the car for a long moment, letting the air conditioning dry the cold sweat on my neck. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my mind was incredibly clear. I knew they were waiting for me. I knew they thought I was walking blindly into their trap, completely unaware of the $50 million sitting offshore and the forged power of attorney they had filed that very afternoon. I stepped out of the car and walked up the wide brick steps. Before I could even reach for the brass knocker, the heavy mahogany door swung open. My mother Brenda stood there wearing a tailored cashmere sweater and her signature string of pearls. She offered a tight artificial smile that did not reach her cold eyes. She ushered me inside, complaining about the humidity and mentioning how my cheap shoes were tracking dust onto her imported marble foyer. I ignored her insults and followed her through the sprawling house toward the formal dining room. The ambush was perfectly staged. My father Calvin sat at the head of the long oak table, looking every bit the powerful megachurch pastor in his custom suit. His hands were folded together, resting next to a crystal glass of bourbon. My sister Vanessa slouched gracefully in a high-backed chair, scrolling through her phone with a bored expression. And standing right beside my empty chair was Trent. My arrogant white brother-in-law held a thick manila folder and a gold-plated pen. The moment I entered the room, the atmosphere shifted into something suffocating and predatory. Nobody offered me a seat. Nobody asked how my day was. Calvin just nodded at Trent, signaling him to begin. Trent did not waste a single second. He tossed a crisp $500 bill onto the table right in front of me. Then he slid a thick stack of papers across the polished wood. The documents were aggressively folded back on themselves, leaving absolutely nothing visible except a single blank line marked for my signature. Trent tapped the gold pen against the table and told me to sign the documents quickly so they could get back to their evening. He said they were just standard tax filings for the family trust, and that my father was trying to clean up some liabilities. I stared at the folded paper and then looked up at Trent. I asked him why the pages were folded so tightly and why I could not read what I was supposedly signing. Trent sighed heavily and rolled his eyes, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with an expression of pure condescension and told me to just sign the paper. He said that my people always make things so difficult for no reason. He told me that my father was trying to secure generational wealth for the family and that I was being typically stubborn and ungrateful. The racial microaggression hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Trent always loved using phrases like "you people" when talking to me, subtly reminding me of his perceived superiority as a finance bro married into a wealthy black family. My mother immediately rushed to defend him, telling me to stop being difficult and just do what the men asked. She said I was ruining a perfectly pleasant evening with my suspicious attitude. I turned my gaze away from Trent and looked directly at Vanessa. My perfect golden child sister was now watching me with a smug, satisfied smirk. She told me to take the $500 and go buy myself some decent clothes because I looked like a homeless person. The sheer audacity of her entitlement made something snap inside my chest. I asked Vanessa why she was suddenly so concerned about securing the family wealth when she had spent her entire life stealing it. I reminded her in front of everyone about the time she stole our grandmother's antique diamond jewelry. I detailed how she had pawned those priceless family heirlooms to pay for a luxury vacation to Tulum with her friends. I reminded my parents how they had covered up her theft, choosing to file a fraudulent insurance claim for a staged burglary rather than hold their favorite daughter accountable. Vanessa slammed her hands on the table and stood up, her face flushed with sudden rage. My mother gasped and clutched her pearls while my father finally raised his voice, demanding that I show respect in his house. The room erupted into a chorus of shifting blame and loud accusations. They called me bitter and jealous. They said I was obsessed with the past because I had no future of my own. The noise in the room reached a fever pitch as they all closed in around me, trying to pressure me into submission. Trent leaned over the table, pointing the gold pen at my face and yelling at me to sign the paper right now. I looked down at the table. Right next to the folded documents was a large ceramic mug filled with my father's scalding hot black coffee. I reached out slowly, pretending to finally accept the gold pen from Trent's hand. My fingers brushed against the pen, but my wrist deliberately caught the side of the heavy coffee mug. I pushed it hard. The mug tipped over, and dark, scalding liquid flooded across the polished oak table. The hot coffee soaked directly into the thick stack of legal documents, instantly saturating the heavy paper. Trent let out a loud, furious curse. He dropped the pen and frantically grabbed at the soaking wet papers, trying to lift them out of the puddle. His sudden panic was extreme. He yelled at me, calling me a clumsy idiot as he desperately tried to shake the liquid off the pages. But the hot coffee had already dissolved the tight creases. As Trent lifted the ruined documents, the heavy paper lost its structural integrity and unfolded completely under its own soggy weight. The pages slapped wetly against the table, exposing the top half of the primary document. I stepped back from the table and looked down at the ruined paper. The dark coffee stains could not hide the bold black letters printed at the very top of the page. The title of the document stared back at me, confirming my absolute worst nightmare. It read, "Involuntary psychiatric commitment and full asset transfer." I stood completely still as the gravity of their betrayal washed over me. They were not just trying to steal my money. They were actively ambushing me in my childhood home, ready to sign away my freedom and lock me in a psychiatric facility for the rest of my life. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the true depth of their evil. They wanted to erase me completely just to protect their stolen empire. I walked out of the formal dining room without looking back. My father was shouting something about respect and Trent was still cursing over the ruined documents, but I just kept walking. The heavy mahogany front door slammed shut behind me, echoing in the humid Atlanta night. I got into my 10-year-old sedan and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely put the key in the ignition. They had actually tried to commit me. They had a judge sign off on a psychiatric hold just to steal my grandfather's money. I drove back to my small apartment in a complete daze. I needed to think. I needed to plan. But before I could even process what had just happened, my phone began to vibrate violently on the passenger seat. It buzzed once, then twice. Then it became a continuous, angry hum. I pulled into my parking lot and picked up the device. The screen was flooded with notifications. Hundreds of them, then thousands. I opened my social media apps and felt my stomach drop. My sister Vanessa had launched a preemptive strike. She had gone live on her lifestyle Instagram account to her 500,000 followers. I clicked on the recorded video. There was Vanessa sitting in her pristine white kitchen looking disheveled on purpose. She had smeared her mascara to look like she had been crying for hours. She looked directly into the camera and told her followers a heartbreaking story about her mentally unstable sister. She told them I was having a severe psychological breakdown. She claimed I had violently attacked her husband Trent and destroyed important family documents in a fit of absolute rage. Vanessa cried real tears as she begged her followers for prayers. She said her family was doing everything they could to get me the psychiatric help I desperately needed, but I was refusing treatment. She painted herself as the devoted, loving sister, trying to save me from my own insanity. The comments under the video were a bloodbath. Her loyal followers were tearing me apart. My direct messages were filled with pure hate. Strangers were calling me psycho and violent and telling me how lucky I was to have a sister who cared so much. They told me to go lock myself in a ward before I hurt someone. Vanessa had weaponized her entire audience against me in less than an hour. She was controlling the narrative just like she always did. She was making sure that if I tried to tell anyone the truth about the $50 million or the forged power of attorney, I would just look like a crazy person having a delusion. I threw the phone onto the couch and paced across my tiny living room. My chest felt tight. They were trying to back me into a corner. They wanted me to panic and go online to defend myself. They wanted me to sound frantic and erratic so they could use my own words against me in front of a judge. Suddenly, the screen lit up with a phone call. It was not an internet troll. It was my boss, Richard, from the forensic accounting firm. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night. Richard never called me this late unless it was a massive corporate emergency. I answered the phone and tried to keep my voice as steady and professional as possible. Richard did not bother with pleasantries. He asked me if I was okay. He sounded deeply uncomfortable. He told me that my mother Brenda had just called him on his personal cell phone. My mother had somehow tracked down my boss outside of business hours to express her deep concern for my mental well-being. Richard explained that my mother told him I was experiencing a severe manic episode. She warned him that I was acting erratic and aggressive, and suggested that my access to sensitive financial audits should be immediately suspended for the safety of the firm. My own mother was trying to get me fired. She was trying to strip away my only source of independent income so I would have absolutely no choice but to rely on them. They were systematically dismantling every pillar of my life. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath. I told Richard that I was perfectly fine. I explained calmly that my family was going through a very complicated legal dispute regarding my late grandfather's estate, and that they were using intimidation tactics to force my hand. I assured him that my work would not be affected and I would be in the office at 8 in the morning as usual. Richard sounded relieved, but he advised me to take a few personal days to sort out the drama. I hung up the phone and looked around my dark apartment. Vanessa wanted a public war. My mother wanted me unemployed and desperate. Calvin and Trent wanted me heavily medicated in a locked facility while they drained my inheritance. They expected me to fight back emotionally. They expected me to go on Instagram and scream about how unfair they were being. But I am not an influencer, and I am not a reality television star. I am a forensic accountant. I do not fight with tears and hashtags. I fight with bank records and wire transfers and paper trails. I opened my laptop and logged into the encrypted portal for the offshore limited liability company I had established that morning. The $50 million was sitting there safe and entirely under my biometric control. My family had no idea the money was already gone. They thought the transfer was still pending for tomorrow. I did not waste a single cent of my energy defending myself online. I let Vanessa's followers call me crazy. I let my mother think she had successfully ruined my career. Instead, I used a secure encrypted browser to contact an elite private intelligence firm based out of Washington, D.C. They were a group of former federal investigators who specialized in corporate espionage and high-level financial forensics. Their retainer was outrageously expensive, but I now had the resources of a small country. I drafted a highly detailed, secure message to the firm. I authorized a $1 million immediate retainer fee from the offshore account. I gave them 2 targets. The first target was Trent's Wall Street hedge fund. I knew Trent was arrogant and careless. Men who steal from their own family members always steal from their clients. I instructed the investigators to dig into his offshore holdings, his shell companies, and his corporate expense accounts. I wanted every hidden transaction and every illegal kickback brought into the light. The second target was my father Calvin and his pristine megachurch. For years, my father had preached about the prosperity gospel while his congregation struggled to pay rent. He drove imported luxury cars and lived in a mansion while passing the collection plate twice on Sundays. I told the intelligence firm to audit the church's tax-exempt status. I wanted to see the real estate portfolios, the hidden pastoral discretionary funds, and the dummy charities he used to launder the tithe money. I pressed send and watched the encrypted message vanish into the ether. My family wanted to play dirty. They wanted to destroy my life to protect their image. They had no idea that I was about to buy the match that would burn their entire fake empire straight to the ground. The private intelligence firm worked faster than I could have ever imagined. Less than 48 hours after I sent that encrypted message, my secure portal chimed with an incoming data packet. I was sitting at my kitchen island nursing a cold cup of black coffee when the notification popped up on my screen. I opened the file and began to read through the preliminary forensic report. My eyes scanned the offshore routing numbers and the shell company ledgers. What I found was not just standard white-collar greed. It was a financial massacre of biblical proportions. Trent and my father were not just wealthy men trying to steal more wealth. They were desperate men standing at the edge of a cliff. The investigators had uncovered the absolute truth behind my father's megachurch and Trent's supposed Wall Street success. It turned out Trent was not a financial genius at all. 2 years ago, he had taken $45 million and invested it entirely into an offshore cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme. The crypto platform collapsed overnight, wiping out every single penny of the investment. But the $45 million did not belong to Trent. It belonged to my father's church. Calvin had secretly handed over the entire church pension fund to Trent. He gave his favorite son-in-law the retirement savings of hundreds of church employees, faithful administrative staff, elderly janitors, and loyal choir directors. My father had embezzled their futures so Trent could play crypto billionaire. When the Ponzi scheme collapsed, they panicked. They spent the last 2 years moving money between shell companies, using new tithe donations to cover the missing pension payouts, and cooking the church accounting books to hide the massive $45 million black hole. But the music was about to stop. The investigators intercepted a sealed federal document during their digital dive. The FBI and the IRS had noticed the irregularities. A massive joint federal audit was scheduled for next Wednesday. Calvin and Trent knew that once the federal auditors opened those books, they would instantly see the missing $45 million. My father, the revered pastor, and Trent, the brilliant hedge fund manager, would both be facing decades in federal prison for wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. That was why they needed my inheritance. They did not just want to get richer. They needed $50 million in completely clean, untraceable cash to silently replace the stolen pension fund before the federal auditors arrived next week. I stared at the glowing screen as the sheer evil of their plan washed over me. They needed my grandfather's trust fund to save their own skin, and the only way to get it was to declare me mentally incompetent and lock me away forever. My psychotic break was the perfect cover story to seize my assets without raising any suspicion. My hands shook as I downloaded the entire dossier onto a secure external hard drive. I had them. I had the wire transfer receipts, the fake crypto wallets, and the forged church ledgers. All I needed to do was hand this drive over to the FBI agents who were already circling my father's megachurch. Their empire was finished. The smear campaign Vanessa launched against me on Instagram meant absolutely nothing compared to federal prison sentences. I closed my laptop and stood up to grab a glass of water. My heart was pounding with a mixture of terror and victory. I finally understood the complete puzzle. Suddenly, a loud, aggressive pounding echoed through my small apartment. The sheer force of the impact made my front door rattle against its hinges. I froze in the center of my kitchen. I had not ordered food. My friends were at work. Nobody knew I was home except my boss, and he thought I was taking personal time. The pounding came again, louder and more frantic this time. Someone jiggled the door handle violently, trying to see if it was unlocked. I crept slowly toward the front door, making sure not to make a single sound on the hardwood floor. I held my breath and leaned close to the cool wood, pressing my eye against the small glass peephole. My blood ran completely cold. Standing in the hallway directly outside my apartment door was my brother-in-law, Trent. He was not wearing his usual tailored suit. He was wearing jeans and a dark jacket, and he was sweating heavily. But it was not Trent that made my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. Standing right behind him were two massive men wearing pale blue medical scrubs. One of the men was holding a heavy-duty canvas straitjacket and a medical bag. The other man was holding a ring of thick leather restraints. Trent slammed his fist against the door again and yelled for me to open up. He shouted through the wood, telling me that they were here to get me the help I needed. They had actually brought the psychiatric extraction team right to my doorstep. Trent pounded his fist against the wood again, making the door frame rattle violently. "Aaliyah, please open the door," he called out, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We are just trying to get you the help you need. We love you, and we cannot watch you spiral like this anymore." His words made my stomach churn with pure disgust. He sounded so perfectly reasonable, like a concerned brother-in-law just doing his best to save a sick relative. If any of my neighbors were listening through the thin walls, they would think I was a genuine danger to myself. I backed away from the peephole as one of the heavy-set orderlies stepped forward and slammed his massive shoulder against the door. The wood splintered around the deadbolt with a loud, terrifying crack. They were actually going to break in and drag me out in a straitjacket. Pure adrenaline flooded my veins, erasing any lingering trace of panic. I did not scream, and I did not freeze. I turned around and sprinted into my bedroom. I grabbed my encrypted laptop and shoved it into my heavy leather tote bag. I snatched the external hard drive containing the FBI dossier, the fake crypto wallets, and the forged church ledgers, and zipped it safely into the inner waterproof pocket. The front door groaned under another massive impact. The deadbolt was giving way, and the hinges were tearing out of the drywall. I ran to my bedroom window and threw it open. The cold night air hit my face as I climbed out onto the rusted metal fire escape. I pulled the glass window shut behind me, just as I heard the sickening crunch of my front door finally caving into the living room. Heavy boots stomped across my hardwood floors. I heard Trent yelling at the men to check the bedroom and the bathroom and to secure the perimeter. I scrambled down the iron stairs as fast as I could, my breath pluming in the cold air. The metal steps rattled slightly under my weight, but the noise was masked by the sounds of traffic in the distance. My feet hit the wet pavement of the back alley, and I did not look back for a single second. I ran through the shadows, staying close to the damp brick walls and avoiding the bright streetlights. I was officially a fugitive from my own family. They had a fraudulent medical order with my name on it, and if those fake orderlies caught me, I would wake up heavily sedated in a locked psychiatric ward while Trent drained my offshore accounts. I kept running until my lungs burned and my apartment building was several blocks away. I needed a secure place to stay where my family could not track my regular credit cards or ping my phone location. I walked into the lobby of the Grand Regency, a 5-star luxury hotel downtown that I never could have afforded yesterday. The pristine marble floors and massive crystal chandeliers were a sharp contrast to the dark, grimy alley I had just crawled out of. I approached the concierge desk and used the digital corporate card linked to my new offshore accounts. I booked their top-floor penthouse suite under the fake name Maya Carmichael. The concierge did not blink an eye at the massive incidental deposit clearing instantly. 10 minutes later, I was locking the heavy double doors of a suite that cost $3,000 a night. I dropped my tote bag on the massive king-sized bed and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering city skyline. I was safe for the moment. The biometric locks on my accounts held the $50 million completely out of their reach. But sitting alone in a luxury hotel room would not stop the vicious smear campaign Vanessa was running online. Hiding in the shadows would not put my father and Trent behind bars where they truly belonged. They would keep hunting me using their money and their church influence to track me down like an animal. I realized then that I could not just disappear and play the victim. I had to cut the head off the snake in the most public way possible. I opened my laptop and pulled up the church's public event calendar. Tomorrow night was the annual Prosperity Charity Gala. It was my father's biggest fundraising event of the entire year, hosted in the grand ballroom of his megachurch. Hundreds of wealthy donors, local politicians, and high society socialites would be in attendance. It was the exact audience my father and Trent relied on to maintain their flawless, holy reputation. My father desperately needed that gala to go perfectly to secure more blind donations before the federal auditors arrived next week. A cold, calculated smile spread across my face as I stared at the glowing screen. I was not going to hide anymore. I was going to put on a beautiful dress walk right through the front doors of their precious gala and burn their entire empire to the ground in front of everyone they wanted to impress. The heavy doors of the Maybach closed with a solid thud, sealing me inside a quiet sanctuary of leather and tinted glass. My two elite security guards sat in the front seats, their broad shoulders completely blocking the view through the windshield. I watched the neon city lights bleed across the dark windows as we drove toward the grand ballroom. The $15,000 midnight blue silk gown pooled around my ankles, feeling like liquid armor against my skin. I traced the line of the heavy diamond earrings resting against my neck and let my mind drift back to a memory I had tried to bury for years. I was 16 years old, standing in my mother's pristine white kitchen, wearing a thrifted debate team suit. I had just won a regional championship, and I was so proud I could barely breathe. I ran home to show her the trophy, but she did not even look up from her magazine. She poured herself a glass of wine and looked at my scuffed shoes with absolute disgust. She told me I would never have the grace for high society because I was simply too aggressive. She said women in our circle needed to be soft and submissive, and that my constant need to fight and argue made me look desperate and cheap. She told me to stop trying to be something I was clearly not. For years, those words had haunted me, making me second-guess every bold decision I ever made. I had spent my entire adult life trying to shrink myself to fit into their perfectly curated world of quiet luxury and fake smiles. But sitting in the back of the Maybach with $50 million secured in my offshore accounts and a federal prison sentence loaded onto a hard drive in my lap, I finally understood the truth. My aggressiveness was not a flaw. It was a survival mechanism. It was the exact trait that had kept me alive when they tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward. My mother wanted a soft daughter, so she could easily manipulate her. She got me instead. I looked down at my phone. The digital countdown timer on my custom script was ticking away. 52 minutes left until the dead man's switch activated. If I did not enter the alphanumeric code before the timer hit 0, the offshore server would automatically email the entire FBI dossier, the forged church ledgers, and the fake crypto wallets to every federal agent and news anchor in Atlanta. The security gave me a deep sense of absolute peace. I was untouchable. The Maybach slowed to a crawl as we approached the sweeping circular driveway of my father's megachurch. The grand ballroom entrance was lit up like a Hollywood premiere. Massive spotlights swept across the night sky, and valet attendants rushed to open the doors of arriving luxury vehicles. I saw local politicians, wealthy donors, and high society socialites climbing out of their cars, wearing expensive tuxedos and designer gowns. This was my father's crowning achievement. This was the annual Prosperity Charity Gala, where he collected millions of dollars in blind donations to fund his lavish lifestyle and cover up his massive embezzlements. My driver pulled the Maybach directly up to the red carpet, bypassing the line of waiting cars. The two security guards stepped out first, moving with synchronized military precision. They scanned the crowd and took their positions on either side of the rear door. One of them reached out and pulled the handle, opening the door to the humid Atlanta night. The flash of photographer cameras immediately blinded me, but I did not flinch. I stepped out of the vehicle and planted my designer heels firmly onto the red carpet. I stood tall, letting the expensive silk gown catch the bright lights. The whispers started almost immediately. People in the crowd recognized me as Pastor Calvin's estranged daughter, but they had never seen me looking like this. I was not the quiet, tired forensic accountant in a cheap suit anymore. I was a billionaire stepping onto the battlefield. I checked my phone one last time to ensure the countdown was still active. 48 minutes. I slipped the phone back into my clutch and looked up at the massive oak doors of the ballroom. I walked forward, my guards flanking me like a protective wall, ready to give my family the surprise of a lifetime. The massive oak doors swung open as my security guards pushed them wide, and the immediate wave of classical music and polite high society chatter hit my ears. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of my father's vanity. Thousands of white orchids draped from the ceiling, and crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the wealthy donors sipping champagne. I stepped over the threshold, and the heavy silk of my midnight blue gown swept across the marble floor. It started with a single gasp near the entrance, but the silence spread through the massive room like a wildfire. The soft hum of conversation completely died as heads turned in my direction one by one. The wealthy socialites and local politicians stared at me in absolute shock. They had all heard the whispered rumors my family had carefully planted. They thought I was a broken girl suffering from a severe mental breakdown, hiding away from the world. Instead, they were looking at a woman who radiated absolute power, flanked by two massive men in tactical suits. I held my chin high, letting them take in the diamond earrings and the flawless $15,000 designer gown. I looked exactly like the billionaire I was always meant to be. Across the room, standing near the front row of VIP tables, was Trent. He had a crystal flute of champagne in his hand, and he was schmoozing with a local real estate developer. I watched the exact second his eyes locked onto mine. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the polished marble floor. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the warm ballroom lights. He muttered something to the developer and began pushing his way through the crowd toward me. His face twisted into a mask of pure panic and rage. My guards tensed as Trent stormed up to us, but I raised a single hand to let them know I had it under control. Trent stopped inches from my face, his chest heaving under his tailored tuxedo. He leaned in close so the staring guests could not hear his vicious tone. "Are you crazy?" he whispered furiously, his eyes darting around the silent ballroom. "How did you get past the orderlies? I am calling the police right now and having you thrown in a locked psych ward tonight. You are having a severe episode, Aaliyah, and you are making a massive scene." He reached out to grab my arm, but one of my security guards instantly stepped forward, blocking his hand with a chest as solid as a brick wall. Trent recoiled, blinking in shock at the sheer physical force standing between us. I looked my brother-in-law up and down, feeling absolutely no fear, just a deep, overwhelming sense of victory. My mother was right about one thing. I was aggressive, and right now that aggression felt incredible. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us, and smiled sweetly right into his terrified eyes. "Call them, Trent," I said, my voice perfectly calm and even. "Call the police right now. In fact, ask for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I would absolutely love to show them your Cayman Island bank statements and the $45 million missing from the church pension fund." Trent froze completely. His mouth fell open, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and realized that lifting his foot would mean instant destruction. His eyes flicked down to the heavy leather clutch in my hand where my phone and the dead man's switch timer rested safely inside. He knew in that exact moment that the game was entirely over. I had the proof and I had the power. I did not wait for him to find his words. I turned my back on him, leaving him paralyzed in the middle of the crowd. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the ballroom. The sea of wealthy donors parted for me, stepping aside as if I were royalty. My guards walked right behind me, ensuring no one dared to intervene. At the front of the room, my father stood on the raised stage holding a microphone. He was frozen, mid-sentence, his charismatic pastor smile melting off his face as he stared down at me. He had been giving his usual tear-jerking speech about faith and family unity right before I walked in. I climbed the 3 carpeted steps to the main stage, my designer heels sinking softly into the plush fabric. My father took a step back, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and sheer terror. He looked from me to Trent, who was still standing paralyzed in the center aisle. I walked straight up to my father, looked him dead in the eye, and took the microphone right out of his shaking hand. I gripped the cold metal of the microphone and turned to face the sea of 500 elite guests. The silence in the grand ballroom was so absolute that I could hear the faint hum of the stage lights above me. I did not even look at my father, who was standing completely frozen right next to me. Instead, I looked out at the wealthy donors, the local politicians, and the high society socialites who blindly funded his empire year after year. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers and filling every corner of the massive room. "I know you are all expecting a heartwarming speech about faith and family tonight, but we are going to talk about the absolute truth instead." I paused for a moment, letting the heavy tension build in the space between us. I am sure many of you have heard the tragic rumors my family has been carefully spreading around town this week. The quiet whispers that I suffered a complete mental breakdown. The heartbreaking story that I am currently locked away in a psychiatric facility for my own safety. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father frantically waving his hand. He was gesturing wildly to the sound technician at the back of the room, trying to get him to cut the audio to my microphone. But the technician was already backing away from the soundboard, holding his hands up in defeat, because my second security guard had calmly walked over and stood directly in front of the mixing console. He folded his massive arms across his chest, ensuring that my microphone was going to stay on until I was finished. Suddenly, my mother Brenda pushed her way through the front row of VIP tables. She practically threw herself onto the edge of the stage, tears already streaming down her perfectly contoured face. She was playing the ultimate victim, throwing herself into the role of the heartbroken mother to absolute perfection. "Please forgive her," Brenda cried out, her voice carrying through the silent room, even without a microphone. "My daughter is terribly sick and she does not know what she is saying. We are just trying to get her the medical help she so desperately needs right now." She reached up, trying to grab my ankle to pull me away from the center of the stage. I calmly stepped back from her grasping hands and reached into my designer clutch. I did not mention the $50 million safely secured in my offshore accounts. I was not ready to drop the final blade of the guillotine just yet. Instead, I pulled out a thick folded piece of paper with a heavy embossed legal seal. I held the certified document high up in the air for the entire ballroom to see. The crisp white paper caught the bright stage lights, making the gold seal glint for the audience. I looked down at my mother, who was still putting on a masterclass in fake weeping at the edge of the stage. "If I am so terribly sick, Mom," I said, my voice ringing through the speakers with crystal clear precision, "if I am completely out of my mind and need to be locked away, then I would love to know why Trent and Dad just forged a legal power of attorney document to access a private bank account they thought only had a few $1,000s in it." My mother stopped crying instantly. Her mouth hung open and the fake tears dried up on her cheeks as she stared at the legal document in my hand. The silence in the grand ballroom grew even heavier, pressing down on everyone like a physical weight. My father, Calvin, finally found his voice and lunged toward me, trying to snatch the microphone back, but my security guard moved faster. He stepped between us, shifting his massive frame to block my father completely. Calvin stumbled backward, his holy man persona fracturing into pure panicked desperation. I looked out at the sea of wealthy donors and church elders. They were watching their perfect pastor unravel right in front of their eyes. "It is time for the sermon," I said, my voice steady and echoing through the massive speakers. But tonight, the message is not coming from Pastor Calvin. It is coming from the man who actually built this family and funded this church. I raised my free hand and gave a sharp nod to the back of the room. My second security guard, standing by the mixing console, signaled my tech team waiting in the luxury suite across town. The massive digital projector screens behind the stage, normally used to display Bible verses and donation goals, flickered for a second. The bright church logos disappeared and were replaced by a grainy video file. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. Standing on the massive screens towering 20 feet above my father was my grandfather Jeremiah. He was sitting in his leather wingback chair in his old study, looking exactly the way he did 8 years ago, before the illness took his strength. He looked directly into the camera with those sharp, piercing eyes that used to terrify my father. The audio kicked in, and my grandfather's deep, raspy voice filled the room. "If you are watching this, it means my absolute worst fears have come true," my grandfather said from the screen. "It means I am dead, and my greedy son-in-law Calvin has finally shown his true colors." I watched my father physically shrink on the stage. He looked around wildly for a way to stop the video, but my guards held their positions, ensuring the broadcast continued. "Calvin is a fraud." My grandfather continued, his recorded voice dripping with absolute disgust. "He is not a man of God, and he is not a brilliant businessman. 30 years ago, he nearly bankrupted our entire family with his reckless vanity projects and illegal real estate schemes. I bailed him out to protect my daughter Brenda, but I knew he would never change. He only cares about appearances and wealth, and he infected his children with that exact same toxic greed. All of them except Aaliyah." The camera zoomed in slightly on my grandfather's face. He looked incredibly tired but completely resolute. I knew Calvin would eventually destroy the church finances and come looking for my money to save his own skin, my grandfather said. That is why I liquidated my true assets years ago. I did not have a few $1,000s left. I had $50 million in clean, untraceable offshore accounts. And I left every single penny of it in an ironclad blind trust for Aaliyah. She was the only one in this family who refused to participate in their toxic vanity. She never cared about the country clubs or the designer clothes or the fake holy image. She was real, and she was the only one I could trust to protect the legacy. The wealthy donors in the audience were whispering furiously to each other, pulling out their phones to record the massive screens. My mother had slumped onto the edge of the stage, hiding her face in her hands, unable to keep up her victim act any longer. Trent was still frozen in the center aisle, looking like he was about to pass out. The video of my grandfather leaned forward in his leather chair, delivering his final message directly to the camera. His eyes seemed to burn right through the screen. I left Aaliyah the money to protect her from them. His raspy voice echoed one last time. But if they ever try to take it from her, if they try to steal this, Aaliyah burn their empire to the ground. The video abruptly cut to black, leaving the church logo glowing on the screen. The massive ballroom was in a state of absolute shock. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence was deafening as 500 elite guests turned their eyes back to me, standing on the stage holding the microphone and $50 million worth of absolute power. The silence in the room was so thick it felt heavy against my skin. 500 pairs of eyes shifted from the blank projector screen to my father, who was visibly trembling, and then finally back to me. I stood on the edge of the stage, looking down at the empire my grandfather had ordered me to burn. Suddenly, the quiet was broken by the sound of scuffling feet. Trent had finally snapped out of his paralyzed state in the center aisle. The panic on his face had completely morphed into a desperate kind of self-preservation. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one, and he was not about to drown with my father. He pushed past a waiter, ignoring the gasps of the wealthy donors, and scrambled up the side stairs of the stage. Before my security guards could toss him off the platform, he lunged toward the wooden podium and snatched the spare microphone from its stand. "Listen to me, please," Trent yelled into the mic, his voice cracking with pure desperation. I had absolutely no idea what Calvin was doing behind closed doors. I was manipulated into handling those offshore accounts. Calvin lied to me about the church funds and the charity donations. I am just a financial advisor. I only did what the head of this church instructed me to do. He held his hands up, trying to look like an innocent victim caught in the crossfire. He was throwing my father right under the bus without a single second of hesitation. My father turned to him, his face turning purple with a mixture of betrayal and fury. But before he could speak, a piercing scream ripped through the front of the ballroom. My sister Vanessa pushed her chair back so violently it crashed to the marble floor. She stood there in her expensive emerald gown, her perfect high society facade completely shattering as she stared at her husband on the stage. "You absolute coward!" Vanessa screamed, her voice echoing through the massive room without needing a microphone. "You are abandoning us to save your own skin. Do not act like you are innocent, Trent. I was standing right there in the Home Office when you forged those documents. You told me it was the only way to secure our lifestyle." The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. The local politicians and real estate developers were practically falling over each other, trying to back away from the blast zone of my family's implosion. Vanessa was crying now, her mascara running down her cheeks, as she realized the man she married was leaving her to take the fall. Trent stammered, gripping the podium, trying to form another excuse, but the damage was already done. I could not help it. A low, dark laugh escaped my lips, and it boomed through the ballroom speakers. The sound was so cold and steady that the whispers in the crowd instantly died down. Everyone turned their attention back to me. I walked slowly across the stage until I was standing just a few feet away from my terrified brother-in-law. My midnight blue silk gown brushed against the carpet, and my guards shadowed my every step. I looked at him with absolute pity. "Trent, you did not get manipulated by anyone. I said, laughing softly into the microphone. You seem to have forgotten who you are dealing with. I am a forensic accountant. For the last 6 months, I have spent every waking hour digging through the encrypted files you thought were so cleverly hidden. I tracked the exact digital footprint of every single transaction you made. Trent gripped the podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He shook his head slightly, begging me silently to stop, but I was just getting started. I tracked the IP address of the forged psychiatric hold and the fake power of attorney. I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clear authority. It did not come from my father's computer. It came directly from your private secure terminal at your Wall Street office. You were not a pawn in my father's game, Trent. You were the mastermind who orchestrated the entire thing. The silence following my words was so heavy it felt like the air had been completely sucked out of the room. Trent collapsed into a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands as the reality of his exposure settled over him. My sister Vanessa was sobbing uncontrollably, realizing her perfect Wall Street husband was entirely willing to let her family take the fall for his crimes. But it was my mother who finally broke the quiet. The fake tears instantly vanished from her perfectly powdered cheeks. The grieving mother act evaporated into thin air because she realized the performance was no longer working to win over the crowd. Her face contorted into an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. She pushed herself off the edge of the stage and stood up straight, her chest heaving with absolute rage. "You ungrateful little brat!" Brenda screamed, her voice echoing harshly against the crystal chandeliers. Her tone was so vicious that the wealthy donors sitting at the front tables actually recoiled in shock. "You owe us everything!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at my face. "That money belongs to this family. We fed you, we clothed you, we gave you a roof over your head when you were nothing but a miserable, difficult child. You owe us for the very blood in your veins, and now you are standing here completely destroying our legacy." I stood on the stage looking down at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. The woman who had eagerly signed the forged papers to lock me in a psychiatric ward just so she could buy more designer handbags and host more lavish dinners. She was practically shaking with fury, demanding lifelong gratitude for doing the absolute bare minimum required of a parent. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I held the microphone close and looked dead into her furious eyes, letting her venom wash over me without flinching a single muscle. "You never cared about a legacy, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly steady and cold enough to freeze the entire ballroom. "You only ever cared about your status. You cared about your public image and your expensive luncheons. You cared about walking into the elite Oaks Country Club and having everyone look at you with envy. That was your true religion." My mother opened her mouth to scream another vicious insult, but I did not give her the chance to speak. And speaking of the elite Oaks Country Club, I continued keeping my gaze locked entirely on hers. I noticed they were struggling with some massive financial issues recently. They had over $10 million in outstanding debt. So I bought that debt yesterday morning. I officially own the club now. And effective immediately, your membership is permanently revoked. You are banned. Trent backed away from the podium, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but no words came out. The devastating truth of his digital footprint hung in the air, completely destroying his desperate attempt to play the victim. Vanessa was looking at him with pure revulsion, taking a physical step away from her own husband. The elite donors and church elders in the crowd were murmuring furiously, their whispers creating a low roar that filled the grand ballroom. They were watching the holy and untouchable family absolutely cannibalize each other on stage. But it was my mother, Brenda, who finally snapped the tension. All evening she had been playing the role of the frail weeping pastor's wife, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief and leaning on my father for support. But as she watched the $50 million slipping through her fingers, as she watched her perfect son-in-law exposed as a criminal and her husband outed as a fraud, the fake tears instantly vanished. The delicate trembling act completely evaporated. Her face flushed an ugly shade of crimson, and her posture straightened into something rigid and terrifying. She pushed past my father, shoving his arm away with a violent jerk, and marched to the edge of the stage. She did not even bother asking for the microphone. She did not care who was watching anymore. The humiliation of being outsmarted by the daughter she always treated like garbage had completely broken her carefully crafted socialite facade. "You ungrateful little brat!" my mother screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unhinged fury. Her shriek echoed off the high ceiling, silencing the murmurs of the wealthy guests. "You owe us everything, Aaliyah. That money belongs to this family. It is our money." She was practically foaming at the mouth, her hands curled into tight fists at her sides. I stood there perfectly still, letting her venom wash over me while the entire ballroom watched the real Brenda reveal herself. "We fed you. We clothed you. We gave you a roof over your head when you were nothing but a miserable, difficult child," she screamed, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at my face. "You owe us for the blood in your veins, and now you are standing here destroying our legacy. You are ruining everything we built." The sheer entitlement in her voice was staggering. She genuinely believed that providing the basic biological necessities of a parent somehow gave her the right to steal my grandfather's entire fortune. She believed that locking me in a psychiatric ward to gain control of my assets was completely justified because she had bought me clothes when I was a teenager. I looked dead at her. The pity I had felt for my family was completely gone, replaced by a cold, surgical precision. I raised the microphone to my lips. "You never cared about a legacy, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying calm that cut through her hysterics. "You only ever cared about your status. You cared about your public image and your expensive luncheons. You cared about walking into the elite Oaks Country Club and having everyone look at you with envy. That was your true religion. That was the only legacy you ever bothered to protect." My mother flinched as if I had physically struck her. Her eyes darted toward the front row of tables where several members of the country club board were currently sitting and watching her meltdown with expressions of absolute disgust. She opened her mouth to scream another insult to defend her precious social standing, but I cut her off. "And speaking of the elite Oaks Country Club," I continued, keeping my gaze locked entirely on hers so she could not look away. "I noticed they have been struggling with some massive financial issues lately. They had over $12 million in outstanding debt from their recent golf course expansions and clubhouse renovations. It was practically bankrupting them." The ballroom was dead silent. Even my father had stopped moving, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was about to say next. "So I bought that country club's debt yesterday morning," I said, letting the words hang in the air for a long moment. "I officially own the paper on the club now, which means I own the club." My mother's face turned stark white. The crimson flush of anger drained away, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. She took a stumbling step back, away from the edge of the stage. Her hands moved to cover her mouth, but it was too late to hide her horror. She looked around the room, seeing the faces of her wealthy friends turning away from her one by one. And as the new primary debt holder and silent owner of the Elite Oaks Country Club, I made my very first executive decision this afternoon. I said, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. "Effective immediately, your membership is permanently revoked. You are banned, Mom. You will never set foot on that property ever again." My mother literally collapsed onto the polished wooden floor of the stage. Her legs simply gave out from underneath her as the weight of my words crushed the only thing she truly loved in this world. The Elite Oaks Country Club was her entire identity. It was the absolute center of her shallow universe. It was where she hosted her weekly high society luncheons and showed off her designer jewelry to women who secretly despised her. It was the one place where she felt superior to everyone else. Now she was permanently exiled from her own private paradise. She sat there in her expensive emerald gown, sobbing into her hands, but this time the tears were absolutely real. Her perfectly powdered face was smeared with dark mascara, and her carefully styled hair was coming undone. She looked out into the front row, hoping to find a shred of sympathy from the wealthy wives she played tennis with every single Tuesday. Instead, she saw them physically turning their chairs away from the stage. They were whispering furiously to each other, already cutting ties with the disgraced pastor's wife. The social execution was immediate and ruthless, and my mother was forced to watch her entire reputation burn to ashes in real time. I did not waste another second looking at her pathetic display. I turned my back on my mother and faced the 500 elite guests and church elders who were still reeling from the shock of my grandfather's video. The grand ballroom was buzzing with frantic energy as people tried to process the absolute implosion of the Holy Family they had worshipped and funded for decades. I walked to the center of the stage, gripping the microphone tightly, and looked directly at the row of senior church elders sitting at the grand tables near the front. These were the men and women who had built the congregation from the ground up alongside my grandfather. They were elderly, devoted, and completely trusting. They had looked at my father Calvin as a spiritual successor and a man of God. They had absolutely no idea he was nothing more than a greedy parasite feeding off their blind faith. "It is time for the final sermon of the evening," I said into the microphone, my voice echoing clearly over the anxious murmurs of the crowd. "My mother just showed you exactly what she values most in this life, but now I am going to show you exactly how she paid for it." I raised my free hand and gave another sharp nod to the security guard standing by the tech booth at the back of the room. The massive digital screens towering 20 feet above the stage flickered once again. The dark screen vanished and was instantly replaced by high-definition images of highly classified financial documents. There were massive, dense spreadsheets, bank statements, and wire transfer logs displayed in bright, glaring letters for everyone in the ballroom to see. Collective gasps echoed through the massive room as people squinted to read the towering text. I had spent the last 6 months of my life compiling this data, breaking through firewalls, and building an undeniable forensic trail of absolute corruption. "You are looking at the internal ledgers of the church pension fund," I said, my voice steady and cold and clinical. "The fund that holds the retirement savings of every single elder administrator and staff member who dedicated their lives to this ministry. For the last 6 years, my father Calvin and his brilliant financial advisor Trent have been slowly and systematically draining that entire account. They set up a complex web of offshore shell companies using the church charity initiatives as a convenient front. They created fake orphanages and phantom community outreach programs that never saw a single dime of your donations." I raised a small black remote clicker and highlighted a specific column on the massive screens in bright neon yellow. "Right there is the master routing number for a secure account hidden in the Cayman Islands," I explained, pointing at the glaring numbers on the screen. "The account is registered under a corporate entity that Trent established using a fake holding company. Over the past 72 months, they have authorized over 400 separate wire transfers directly from your retirement fund into this private offshore account. They used your life savings to pay for their private jets, their luxury sports cars, their designer wardrobes, and my mother's precious country club memberships. They took the money meant for your future and used it to fund their absolute vanity. All in all, they siphoned exactly $45 million from the people who trusted them the most." The silence in the ballroom shattered instantly. It was replaced by a deafening, violent roar of pure, unadulterated outrage. The senior church elders in the front row, the men and women who had sacrificed their entire lives and donated their hard-earned money for the congregation, stood up from their tables in unison. Their faces were twisted in absolute, furious heartbreak. An elderly man named Deacon Thomas, who had personally mentored my father for over a decade, threw his crystal water glass onto the marble floor, where it shattered into 100 jagged pieces. People were shouting at the top of their lungs, screaming demands for answers, and surging toward the edge of the stage. The wealthy real estate developers and local politicians who had written massive tax-deductible checks to the church were pulling out their phones, frantically calling their own lawyers and demanding their money back. They realized their massive charitable donations were now directly tied to a massive federal crime. The entire grand ballroom had descended into a state of furious, uncontrollable chaos. My father realized in that exact terrifying moment that there was nowhere left to run and nowhere left to hide. His wholly untouchable persona was completely dead and buried. The loyal flock he had manipulated and stolen from for years was now an angry mob demanding his absolute ruin. Calvin's knees visibly buckled. He dropped heavily onto the hard wooden stage right in front of the massive screens displaying the undeniable proof of his criminal enterprise. His sharp, custom-tailored suit bunched up awkwardly around his waist as he pressed his hands together in a desperate pleading gesture. He was weeping openly now, heavy tears streaming down his flushed face as he looked out at the furious, screaming elders. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic squeak as he sobbed without a microphone. "Please, you have to listen to me. You have to understand my vision. I was going to put the money back. It was just a temporary loan to expand the ministry. The Lord knows my heart is pure. Please, you have to forgive your pastor." The pathetic sight of the great Pastor Calvin groveling on his knees and using the Lord to excuse his massive theft only made the crowd angrier. People were demanding justice, demanding that someone lock the doors and call the police immediately. Several younger congregation members were actually trying to climb onto the stage, but my security guards formed a solid human wall to keep the furious crowd at bay. Behind my kneeling father, Trent tried to use the escalating chaos to his advantage. The slick Wall Street financial advisor realized he was completely trapped, and panic took over his senses. He slowly backed away from the wooden podium, his eyes darting wildly around the room as he tried to slip out through the heavy velvet curtains at the rear of the stage. He thought he could abandon his wife and his father-in-law and quietly escape into the night. But my security team was already waiting for him. Two massive guards stepped out from the shadows and grabbed Trent by the arms. They lifted his expensive leather shoes entirely off the floor and dragged him effortlessly back to the center of the stage. They dropped him roughly onto the ground right next to my sobbing father. Trent was thrashing and crying, begging the guards to let him go, but his arrogant Wall Street attitude had completely vanished. His expensive tie was crooked, and his face was covered in a cold, terrified sweat. He was nothing but a cowardly criminal, facing the end of his luxurious free life. He looked at Vanessa, pleading for her help, but my sister just stood there weeping and shaking her head, completely disgusted by the man she had married. I stood perfectly still in the center of the stage, holding the microphone in my hand, and watching the total destruction of their toxic empire unfold, exactly as I had planned. The $50 million my grandfather left me in that ironclad blind trust was completely secure. But the real absolute victory was standing right here, watching the undeniable truth finally drag my family into the harsh light of reality. My father was still on his knees, sobbing into his hands and babbling useless prayers, while my mother sat frozen on the stage floor, staring blankly at the angry, violent crowd that used to worship her. Trent was curled on his side, trembling in pure terror. They had spent their entire lives treating me like a naive child they could easily manipulate and discard. They thought they could steal my inheritance and lock me away in a dark hospital room forever. But they had severely underestimated the only person in the family who actually paid attention to the numbers. "You do not need to call the local authorities," I said into the microphone, my steady voice cutting through the shouting mob like a sharp blade. "I already sent these exact forensic files to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation 3 hours ago. I gave them the routing numbers, the fake shell company registrations, and the forged medical documents they used to try and steal my trust fund. Right on cue, as if the universe itself was validating my grandfather's final wish." The heavy, chaotic atmosphere in the ballroom was pierced by a sharp, high-pitched wailing sound coming from the city streets outside. The noise grew louder and more aggressive by the second. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass doors at the back of the Grand Hotel ballroom, intense, rapid flashes of bright color began to illuminate the dark night. Harsh waves of red and blue lights washed through the glass, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers and casting an eerie, spinning glow over the faces of the terrified guests. The heavy wail of multiple approaching sirens pierced the night air, echoing loudly against the marble walls of the venue. Tires screeched against the pavement as multiple heavy black tactical vehicles pulled up to the main entrance of the hotel. The loud thud of heavy boots and slamming car doors echoed from the lobby. The entire ballroom went dead silent as everyone turned to look at the main doors. My father let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure despair, pressing his forehead against the stage floor. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated my grandfather's glowing church logo on the massive screens one last time. The FBI had finally arrived to collect their prize, and the empire was officially burned to the ground. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom flew open with a violent crash that made the remaining crystal glasses rattle on the tables. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical vests, with the letters FBI printed across their chests, swarmed into the room. Their heavy boots stomped against the marble floors, completely shattering whatever illusion of high society elegance was left. The crowd of wealthy donors and church elders scrambled backward, pushing their chairs out of the way to create a wide, clear path for the armed agents. The red and blue emergency lights from the tactical vehicles outside flashed through the glass, illuminating the sheer terror on my parents' faces. The lead agent, a tall man with a completely rigid expression, marched straight up the side stairs of the stage. He did not look at the glowing screens displaying the offshore accounts. He did not look at the frightened crowd whispering in the aisles. His eyes were locked entirely on my father. "Wait! Hold on," my father shouted, scrambling up from his knees. His face was streaked with sweat and tears, but his desperate ego flared up one last time. He actually tried to puff out his chest and project his booming pulpit voice, adjusting his crooked tie with shaking hands. "Officers, please, there has been a massive misunderstanding here. I am Pastor Calvin Pierce. I am the spiritual leader of this entire congregation. This is a private charity gala, and you are interrupting a sacred gathering. I demand to speak to your superior immediately. I have the mayor on speed dial, and I will have your badges for this disrespect." The lead agent did not even blink. He did not care about the mayor's phone number or the holy title. He grabbed my father by the shoulder and spun him around with a swift, brutal motion. "Calvin Pierce, you are under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny." The agent stated, his voice loud and monotone, carrying easily across the silent room. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." My father let out a high-pitched shriek of absolute panic. "You cannot do this to a man of God," he wailed, struggling weakly against the agent's grip. "This is a setup. I am innocent." My mother Brenda was shrieking from the corner of the stage, watching her husband being treated like a common street criminal. Two more agents stepped in, grabbing Calvin's arms and forcing him face first onto the polished wooden floor of the stage. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the silent room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. My father lay there panting against the wood, his expensive suit ruined, his holy empire reduced to dust. While the agents were reading my father his rights, Trent was completely unraveling. The slick Wall Street financial advisor had crawled backward until his back hit the wooden podium. He was gasping for air, his perfectly styled hair plastered to his forehead with cold sweat. He realized his expensive suits and Ivy League degrees meant absolutely nothing to the federal government. There were no loopholes here. There was no backdoor exit to save him. In a final act of pure desperate cowardice, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking so violently that he kept dropping the device against the podium. The microphone I had placed there earlier was still switched on, amplifying his ragged breathing through the massive ballroom speakers. He hit a number on his speed dial, and his trembling finger accidentally mashed the speakerphone button. The audio connected instantly, and the ringing sound echoed loudly through the entire venue so that every single person in the room could hear it. A stern, aristocratic voice answered on the second ring. The voice belonged to Trent's father, Richard Sterling III, a ruthless old money billionaire who controlled half the commercial real estate in the city. Dad, Trent sobbed, leaning closer to the phone. His voice was high and whining, completely stripped of its usual arrogant confidence. Dad, please, you have to help me right now. The FBI is here. They are arresting Calvin and they are coming for me next. I need you to send the corporate legal team down here immediately. I need you to wire the bail money. Please, Dad, they are going to lock me away. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and freezing cold. The entire ballroom was listening to the great financial mastermind beg his daddy for a bailout, like a terrified, helpless child. Vanessa stood off to the side, holding her hands over her mouth, realizing her husband was not a genius. He was just a spoiled rich kid who had finally been caught. Trent? His father's voice finally echoed through the speakers, deep and dripping with absolute disgust. I have been receiving calls from the country club board for the last 20 minutes. I am watching the local news alerts pop up on my private terminal right now. Dad, I can explain everything. Trent cried out, his voice cracking. It was Calvin. He made me do it. He lied to me. I just need the lawyers to get me out of here and I can fix this. You stole $45 million from a church pension fund. His father's voice cut through the air like a knife echoing from the speakers with crushing authority. You embezzled from a religious charity and left a digital trail so incredibly obvious that you got caught by a 30-year-old girl. You let a local pastor and his daughter completely outsmart you and destroy our reputation in front of the entire city. Dad, please do not do this, Trent begged, falling to his knees on the stage, his tears dripping onto his phone screen. You have to save me. You dragged the Sterling family name through the mud for absolute pennies. His father continued, ignoring Trent's sobbing entirely. You are a pathetic criminal, and worse than that, you are a stupid one. You are a complete disgrace to this family. Do not ever call this number again. The loud final click of the phone hanging up echoed through the ballroom speakers. Trent dropped his phone, staring blankly at the dark screen. The realization that his powerful family was abandoning him to rot in federal prison finally set in. He let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob, burying his face in the carpet as the remaining federal agents closed in around him. They hoisted him up by the arms of his ruined custom suit. Trent did not even try to resist. His legs gave out completely, and he just hung limply between the two agents, crying hysterically. He looked absolutely pathetic as they dragged him across the stage. Vanessa turned her head away, completely unable to look at him. I stood there in the center of the stage, watching them drag my whimpering brother-in-law and my handcuffed father down the stairs and out through the massive glass doors into the cold night. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles slowly faded into the distance, leaving the grand ballroom in a heavy, exhausting silence. Almost everyone had fled the scene. The wealthy donors and the church elders had scrambled out the heavy glass doors the moment the FBI started taking statements, desperate to distance themselves from the massive criminal scandal. The extravagant charity gala was completely dead, and the untouchable Pierce family empire was officially reduced to ashes. I stood near the podium, quietly shutting down my laptop and packing away the digital files that had just sent my father and my brother-in-law to federal prison. I felt a deep, settling peace in my chest. The heavy burden I had carried for years was finally lifted. But I was not entirely alone on the stage. Vanessa was still there, my perfect, beautiful older sister, the golden child who had never faced a single consequence in her entire privileged life, was standing a few feet away, shivering in her thousands of dollars worth of designer silk. Her picture-perfect influencer lifestyle had just been violently ripped away from her. She had built her entire identity on being the flawless pastor's daughter, married to the brilliant Wall Street genius. She thrived on the envy of her millions of followers, posting pictures of her lavish vacations and her massive mansion. Now she was just the unemployed wife of a federal criminal and the daughter of a disgraced fraud. She looked around the empty ballroom, searching for someone to fix her problems. Our mother Brenda was sitting slumped in a chair by the exit being questioned by two stern federal agents. There was no one left to protect Vanessa. There was no one left to bail her out or hand her a blank check. She turned and looked at me. The absolute terror in her eyes was staggering. She stumbled across the polished wooden floor of the stage. She did not walk with her usual arrogant strut. She practically crawled, dragging her expensive gown behind her. She collapsed right at my feet, falling heavily to her knees. Her tears were completely genuine this time. Her heavy, expensive makeup was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks, ruining her flawless complexion. "Ah, Leah, please!" she sobbed, grabbing frantically at the hem of my pants. "You have to help me. We are sisters. We are blood. You cannot just walk away and leave me like this." I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely invisible. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air, as the brutal reality of her new situation settled over her. This was the same sister who had laughed when my parents forged documents to lock me away. The same sister who had eagerly signed off on stealing my grandfather's trust fund so she could buy more designer handbags. "I have absolutely nothing, Aaliyah," she cried, her voice echoing pathetically in the quiet, empty room. "My entire life is over. The house is entirely in Trent's name. His accounts are going to be frozen by the feds tomorrow morning. They are going to seize the cars and the property and the jewelry. I will be out on the street. I do not even have a real job. I am going to lose all my brand deals the second this hits the morning news. My followers will completely destroy me online. Please, you have all $50 million in your trust fund. You own the country club now. You have the power to fix this. You can hire me the best defense lawyers in the state. You can buy me a new house. Please, I am begging you, do not leave me with nothing." I stared down at her trembling, pathetic frame. She was begging for my wealth, the exact same wealth she had plotted to steal just hours ago. She only cared about our blood relation now that her own blood was tainted with federal indictments and public ruin. There was no remorse in her apologies, only a desperate, selfish panic because she was finally facing the real world without a safety net. I slowly reached into my designer purse. My movements were deliberate and completely calm. I bypassed my car keys and my phone, sliding my hand into the side pocket of my leather wallet. I pulled out a crisp $100 bill. It was the exact same denomination her husband Trent had tossed at me just a few days ago in my grandfather's dusty house when he arrogantly told me to buy some cheap wine and get out of his sight. I held the bill lightly between my fingers, letting the green paper catch the dim light of the crystal chandeliers above us. Vanessa stopped crying for a fraction of a second. Her tear-filled eyes tracked the money with a sudden glimmer of desperate, greedy hope. She actually thought I was going to hand it to her. She actually believed that after everything she had done to me, I was going to bail her out the way our parents always did. She thought her tears were still a valid currency. Instead, I opened my fingers. I watched the crisp $100 bill flutter through the air and land softly on the wooden floor right in front of her muddy, ruined knees. "Go buy yourself some cheap wine." "Vanessa," I said, my voice perfectly flat and completely empty of any sympathy. "You are going to need it." I turned my back on my sister, leaving her sobbing on the floor of the empty ballroom, and walked out into the cool night air. The parking lot was swarming with federal vehicles and news vans, but my private security team quietly escorted me through a side exit to a waiting black SUV. I sank into the leather seats and watched the flashing red and blue lights fade into the distance as we drove away from the wreckage of the Pierce family empire. By the time the sun came up the next morning, the entire city was completely paralyzed by the scandal. My phone vibrated constantly with news alerts and text messages from people who had ignored me for years. Every local network and major national news outlet was running the exact same breaking headline. Pastor Calvin Pierce and Wall Street advisor Trent Sterling arrested in $50 million church pension fraud. I sat at the kitchen island of my new penthouse, sipping hot coffee and watching the morning broadcast. They were calling me a whistleblowing hero, a brave daughter who sacrificed her own flesh and blood to save the retirement funds of hundreds of innocent church members. It was surreal watching the anchors praise my forensic accounting skills and ruthlessly dissect my father's fraudulent network. The morning anchors gleefully reported the outcome of their emergency arraignment. Both Calvin and Trent were officially denied bail. The judge deemed them massive flight risks given the offshore accounts. Trent was going straight to a federal holding facility, and my father was sitting in a cold county jail cell, trading his custom-tailored suits for a standard orange jumpsuit. And then there was my mother. The news choppers hovered over the massive Pierce family estate, broadcasting live as federal agents taped bold foreclosure notices to the heavy iron gates. The government was seizing absolutely everything purchased with the stolen funds. I watched on live television as Brenda was escorted out of her multi-million-dollar mansion carrying nothing but 2 small duffel bags. Her face was hidden behind oversized sunglasses, and she looked frail and entirely broken as she loaded her bags into the back of Vanessa's modest sedan. They had lost absolutely everything in less than 24 hours. The elite country club, the luxury cars, the endless shopping sprees. It was all gone. I turned off the television and the sudden silence in my apartment felt incredibly heavy. I had won. I had executed the perfect revenge. I had protected my grandfather's legacy and stopped them from stealing my trust fund. The monster who had locked me in a psychiatric ward was ruined. The mother who treated me like garbage was essentially homeless. The sister who mocked my pain was completely destitute. But as I looked out over the sweeping city skyline, a strange hollow emptiness settled deep in my chest. The burning adrenaline that had fueled my survival for the last 6 months was completely gone, leaving me feeling incredibly tired. I was a multimillionaire. I was finally free from their control. But the biological family I was born into was officially gone forever. They were legally and socially dead to me. The victory tasted a little like ash. I realized then that revenge, no matter how flawlessly executed, does not magically fix the broken pieces inside of you. The lonely little girl who just wanted her parents to love her was still hiding somewhere in my heart, grieving for a family she never actually had. I needed a distraction from the heavy silence, so I scheduled a meeting with the trust administrators to finalize the transfer of the $50 million. The drive to the downtown financial district was quiet and contemplative. When I walked into the massive glass lobby of the bank, I was treated like absolute royalty. The tellers whispered and pointed, and the senior partners practically tripped over themselves to usher me into the private executive boardroom. Mr. Harrington, the senior bank manager, who had secretly helped me secure the trust against my father's forged medical documents, was waiting for me with a warm, proud smile. We spent 2 hours signing heavy stacks of legal documents and transferring the massive fortune into secure, diversified accounts strictly under my name. The $50 million was officially mine without any restrictions. The legal battle was entirely over, and my grandfather's life work was safe. I shook Mr. Harrington's hand and thanked him deeply for his loyalty to my grandfather. I gathered my designer coat and my bag, feeling a strange sense of finality. I was just about to leave the boardroom to begin my brand new life. I was halfway to the heavy glass door when Mr. Harrington cleared his throat. He looked unusually nervous, wiping his palms on his tailored trousers as he stepped out from behind the massive oak table. "Miss Aaliyah," he said, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed whisper. "There is one last thing your grandfather left for you." I stopped in my tracks and turned around completely confused. We had already gone over every single financial asset in the portfolio. A physical safety deposit box. He continued walking over to a wall safe and pulling a heavy brass key from his vest pocket. It was instructed to be opened only after you claimed the funds. He kept it entirely separate from the financial trust. His strict orders were that you could only see this once you successfully secured the legacy and proved you could handle your family. He wanted to make sure you survived the storm before you saw what was inside. Mr. Harrington gestured toward a heavy steel door at the back of the executive suite. I followed him in complete silence, my heart pounding against my ribs as we entered the secured vault room. He approached a wall of polished metal boxes and inserted his brass key into one of the larger compartments while I provided my thumbprint on the digital scanner. The heavy drawer slid open with a soft metallic glide. Mr. Harrington stepped back, giving me the privacy my grandfather had explicitly requested. I reached inside the cool metal compartment, half expecting to find another stack of corporate deeds or hidden offshore accounts. Instead, my fingers brushed against worn leather. I pulled out 3 thick, weathered journals. They were my grandfather's personal notebooks, the ones he used to carry around the church campus when I was just a little girl. I opened the first journal and saw pages filled with his meticulous handwriting, detailing every single fraudulent transaction he had quietly discovered before he died. He had been building his own private case against Calvin and Trent long before his heart gave out. He had left me the roadmap because he knew I was the only one smart enough to follow it. Reading his notes, I realized my grandfather had never abandoned me to the wolves. He had been quietly preparing me to lead the pack. Beneath the journals lay a single thick envelope made of heavy parchment paper. My name was written across the front in his familiar slanted handwriting. My hands were shaking as I broke the wax seal and unfolded the thick stationery. The date at the top showed it had been written over 3 years ago, right around the time my parents first tried to convince him to cut me out of his life completely and lock me away. My eyes scanned the opening lines, and the cold professional armor I had worn all week finally began to crack. My dearest Ayalea, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means you have successfully navigated the greed of the people who were supposed to protect you. I am so incredibly sorry that I had to leave you alone to fight them, but I knew you were the only one strong enough to do it. I watched them for years, Ayalea. I watched your mother tear you down because your brilliant mind intimidated her shallow vanity. I watched your father dismiss your potential because you refused to blindly follow his hypocritical sermons. I saw every single time they made you feel small, and I saw how you quietly refused to let them break your spirit. The ink was slightly smudged in places, as if the old man had been crying when he wrote it. They will call you difficult because you demand respect. He wrote his words echoing exactly what I had felt my entire life. They will call you a failure because you do not play their vanity games. They will tell you that you do not belong in their perfect picture because you expose their flaws simply by existing. But you must never listen to their venom, my sweet girl. You are the true legacy of our bloodline. The thick paper blurred as hot, heavy tears finally spilled over my eyelashes and dripped onto my trembling hands. I fell to my knees right there on the floor of the bank vault, clutching my grandfather's letter to my chest. For the first time in my entire 30 years of existence, I was finally experiencing the pure, unconditional parental love that I had been completely denied. The heavy, suffocating knot of unworthiness that my mother had planted in my chest when I was a child finally dissolved into nothing. I stayed on the cold floor weeping until my lungs ached, letting go of the abandoned daughter and fully embracing the powerful woman my grandfather knew I could be. I wiped my face and carefully folded the letter, placing it securely in my designer bag alongside the weathered journals. As I stood up from the vault floor, the hollow emptiness that had haunted me all morning was entirely gone. I looked at the heavy steel boxes lining the walls with absolute crystal clarity. I knew exactly what I had to do with the $50 million. I knew exactly what I had to do with the $50 million. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train, but it brought the most profound sense of clarity I had ever experienced. The fortune sitting in those accounts was never meant to be hoarded in offshore tax havens or used to buy massive mansions and fleets of luxury cars for people who traded on fake righteousness. My grandfather had built his incredible wealth with his own 2 calloused hands, working relentlessly through decades of hardship. He had left me the map to dismantle the corrupt empire my father built, but he also left me the foundation to build something entirely new. He wanted me to use his life work to build up others who had been forgotten, ignored, or emotionally starved by the people who were supposed to protect them. I carefully packed the weathered journals and the beautiful handwritten letter into my bag and walked out of the bank with my head held high. 1 year later, the thick, heavy humidity of a brilliant Atlanta afternoon clung to the massive crowd gathered on the pristine concrete plaza. The building rising behind the podium was an absolute architectural masterpiece of sleek, curved glass and dark industrial steel. It stood as a beacon of modern progress, right in the bustling heart of the city, reflecting the bright blue sky in its massive windows. Mounted perfectly above the heavy glass entrance doors were massive brushed silver letters that gleamed in the sunlight, reading the Jeremiah Foundation. I stood at the podium looking out at the sea of reporters, local business leaders, and the very first class of brilliant, determined young Black women our venture capital firm was preparing to fund. I was wearing a sharp-tailored emerald green silk suit that fit me perfectly, commanding the space without needing to raise my voice. My posture was completely different now. My shoulders were pulled back, and the heavy, constant anxiety that used to live like a tight coil in my chest was entirely gone. I smiled a genuine bright smile as the mayor of Atlanta handed me the oversized ceremonial scissors. The cameras flashed in a blinding wave of light as the heavy red silk ribbon was snipped perfectly in half. The crowd erupted into genuine, joyful applause, sending a massive wave of positive energy echoing off the surrounding skyscrapers. My grandfather's money was finally doing exactly what he had always wanted it to do. The Jeremiah Foundation was specifically designed to provide massive unrestricted capital to young Black female entrepreneurs who had absolutely zero family support. We were actively seeking out women who had been thrown away, ignored, or financially abused by the very people who should have believed in them the most. We were giving them the safety net I had to build entirely on my own in the dark. It was the absolute perfect ultimate revenge against a family that only cared about vanity theft and maintaining a flawless fake image. Instead of hoarding power, I was giving it away to the women who actually deserved it. When the cameras finally stopped flashing and the crowd began to filter into the beautiful, massive lobby for the catered reception, I felt a sudden, overwhelming need for a quiet moment alone. The success of the day was beautiful, but the noise was becoming a little overwhelming. I silently signaled to my security team to hang back near the entrance, and I slipped out through the side courtyard. I just wanted a simple cup of coffee to ground myself before facing the endless handshakes and networking inside. I walked 2 blocks down the sunlit street, enjoying the warm southern breeze against my face, until I found a high-end boutique coffee shop tucked away on a quiet, shady corner. The shop was mostly empty, smelling heavily of dark roasted espresso beans and sweet vanilla syrup. The soft hum of indie acoustic music played from hidden speakers, creating a perfectly calm atmosphere. I stepped up to the polished marble counter, resting my hands lightly on the cool stone. A single barista was facing the back wall, furiously scrubbing down one of the heavy industrial espresso machines with a damp cloth. Her shoulders were slumped in a posture of total defeat, and her hair was pulled back into a messy, chaotic bun that looked like it had been hastily tied hours ago. "Excuse me," I said, my voice perfectly calm and polite, echoing slightly in the quiet shop. "I would like a black iced Americano, please." The barista let out a heavy, exhausted sigh and tossed her wet rag onto the counter with a soft, wet slap. She turned around slowly, wiping her damp, raw hands on a dark green apron that was heavily stained with old coffee syrup and bleached spots. The moment her tired eyes met mine, the entire world seemed to freeze completely. The air in the small coffee shop grew incredibly still. It was Vanessa. She was practically unrecognizable from the flawless, arrogant influencer she had been just 12 months ago. Her skin was pale and completely bare of the thousands of dollars of premium cosmetics she used to wear every single day. There were dark, heavy circles under her eyes, speaking of endless, sleepless nights. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails were gone, replaced by chipped raw fingernails ruined by harsh dishwashing chemicals and manual labor. The flawless, untouchable pastor's daughter, who used to look down on everyone from the balcony of her million-dollar mansion, was completely gone. The woman standing in front of me was just an exhausted minimum-wage employee, struggling to survive the crushing reality of a world that did not care about her ruined last name or her frozen bank accounts. Vanessa's mouth fell open slightly as her eyes scanned my face. A dark, heavy flush of pure, humiliating shame crept up her neck and settled into her hollow cheeks. She looked at my expensive emerald silk suit and the confident, peaceful aura radiating from my entire presence. Then she looked down at her own stained apron and her trembling, raw hands. The contrast between our lives was stark and completely undeniable. I waited for her to say something. I stood perfectly still and waited for the usual excuses, or the begging, or the desperate manipulation she had always relied on. I expected her to launch into a sobbing apology, or to ask me for a handout, but she had absolutely nothing left to say. The crushing weight of her husband's 20-year federal prison sentence and our parents' total public disgrace had finally broken the golden child. There was no vanity left in her eyes, only a hollow, defeated acceptance of her new reality. She knew there was no one left to call and no one left to manipulate. I did not smile. I did not smirk or laugh or say a single word about how the mighty had fallen. I felt no need to gloat or rub her face in the dirt because her daily reality was already the ultimate punishment. Dragging her down would only poison the peace I had worked so incredibly hard to build. Instead, I simply pulled my leather wallet from my bag and extracted a crisp $100 bill. It was a quiet echo of the day she and Trent had mocked my poverty, but this time the gesture held absolutely no malice. I placed the crisp bill softly on the marble counter, right next to the small plastic tip jar. "Keep the change," I said, my voice completely steady and totally empty of any anger. Vanessa stared at the green paper, her eyes filling with silent, heavy tears that she stubbornly refused to let fall. Her lower lip trembled as she turned around with shaking hands and poured the cold, dark espresso over a cup of ice. She snapped a clear plastic lid onto the cup and slid the drink across the wet marble counter without ever looking up to meet my eyes again. Her shame was absolute and total. I took the cold cup in my hand, feeling the condensation against my palm. I turned my back on her for the absolute last time, walking toward the exit without a single glance over my shoulder. As I pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped back out into the bright, brilliant Atlanta sun, the warm air wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. The sounds of the city washed over me, bringing a profound sense of closure. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the fresh air, feeling the immense, beautiful weight of my grandfather's true legacy carrying me forward into the future. The generational curse of the Pierce family was entirely broken. The toxic roots of greed and vanity had been completely pulled from the soil and burned to ash, leaving nothing but clean, fertile ground to build upon. I had survived the fire, and I had forged my own magnificent path. I took a sip of the bitter coffee and walked down the street toward the foundation, knowing that I was finally and completely free. The greatest lesson from this journey is that your worth is never defined by the people who failed to love you properly. Family is not just about blood, it is about respect and true support. When the people who are supposed to protect you try to tear you down, the most powerful revenge you can ever take is to survive and build a beautiful life completely without them. Breaking a toxic generational curse takes incredible strength, but it leaves you entirely free. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family to find your own peace, share your experience in the comments below and subscribe for more stories of surviving betrayal.